Good morning. Let's start our class with the prayers. Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwaraha, Guru Sakshat Parbrahma, Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Om Bhu Bhuvaswaha, Tatsavitra Varenayam, Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi, Dhiyo Yo Nah Prachodayat, Asto Ma Satgamya. तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गम्या मृत्योर्मा अमृतम गम्या ओम सहना भवतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहि तेजस्वी नावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहि ओम शांति शांति शांति. Today is the day for Mahabharata for us. And we are in the middle of this chapter with these Pandavas and Kauravas. After learning all those skills from their Acharya, Dronacharya, they are performing. It's almost like a graduation and a performance. And the book which we are reading from has been translated by Mr. Menon, Ramesh Menon, in English. Okay. And we are on page number 174 because it's in the middle of this chapter. And this chapter, title of this chapter is The Exhibition. So let's start from the first full paragraph on the page 174. By now, the crowd was almost delirious because Arjun was showing his skills. But the Pandavas still had not finished. His bowstring sang again, and all at once there were mountains that thrust their way up out of the sand, towering peaks of ice and snow. They stood there so majestic and real, and the crowd still sat around them. Though that arena was hardly big enough to contain a mountain range, all were lost in the archer's miracle. Another magic arrow, the Antra Dhyan Astra, and both Arjun and the mountains vanished, and the arena was bare. When the Pandav reappeared, he was tall as a hill himself, a giant looming over the stadium. Then in a flash, he was a little homunculus, no bigger than a man's thumb, and Ashwathama had to point him out to the crowd, which was past cheering now. It was so overwhelmed. Minuscule Arjun shot a tiny arrow, and a golden chariot appeared, drawn by horses out of a fancy. Himself once more, Arjun rode in that rath, waving to the crowd. As he flew around the arena, he flung an empty quiver high into the air. Before it fell to the ground, switching his bow from hand to hand, he shot 21 arrows into that quiver. Filling it perfectly, it was then that the earth shook and the crowd trembled. First, the people thought it was another of Arjun's wonderful astras, but he himself stopped his chariot, leapt down from it, and stood staring towards the stadium gates. Again, the thunder echoed there. Some of the crowd looked up at the sky to see if a storm was brewing, but above was unbroken, clear blue, falling away to the horizon on every side. Dhritarashtra asked Vidura, "What is that noise? What astra does our nephew summon now?" "It isn't Arjun who made the sound of thunder." The crowd realized the thunder came from the gates. The Pandavas had gathered around Drona. Nearby, his heart stirred powerfully by an intimation of a fortune. Duryodhana also stood with his brothers and Ashwathama beside him. Again and again, the defiant noise echoed at the gates to the arena, always drawing nearer. Drona said, "It is a bowstring being pulled, but only the greatest masters can make their bows sound like this." A startling figure stalked hotly in through the lofty gates. His armor shone like a treasure, and his golden earrings seemed to be made of 2 drops of the sun. Such was the presence and authority of the stranger. The crowd fell hushed, like a golden lion, like a dev. He walked calmly onto the white arena. One look at him, and the people of Hastinapur knew that here was a great warrior, if there ever was one. They saw how the very sunlight seemed to enfold him as if in special grace, and how extraordinary his armor was. Was it armor or his golden skin? His hair fell on his shoulders in dark waves. The bow in his hand and the sword at his wrist glittered as brightly as his eyes. The archer stood at the heart of the arena. You could hear the breeze rustling in the trees outside the stadium. With the assurance of a warrior who has no equal, he gazed unhurriedly around him at the royal enclosure, the stands of the people, at the Pandavas and the Kauravas, at Arjun and Drona, almost with contempt. Not even Drona spoke. Now the stranger bowed quickly to the blind king, to Drona and Krip. In a voice to match the sound of his bowstring, the golden warrior said to Arjun, Pandav, I see you are conceited with the paltry tricks you just performed. Such a mocking smile was on his noble, but also strained and sad face. If your guru allows me, I will repeat every feat of yours with my own refinements. There was a murmur from the people, the instinct of fortune swelling in him moment by moment. Duryodhana stood riveted. He stared at the newcomer as if he was an old friend from another life, perhaps. Drona could not refuse, at least for the curiosity that consumed him. Who was this archer he had never heard of, who claimed he could match Arjun? Show us your skills, stranger. Bowing again to Drona, Karan began a display that wiped the very memory of Arjun's earlier feats from the minds of the people. His fires were fiercer, his ocean in the sky was vaster, brighter. His rain clouds into which he resolved that sea were darker, more threatening and streaked with lightning. The gale he summoned to blow away those clouds howled louder than Arjun's winds. The report with which the earth opened for his Bhaumastra was more deafening. The tunnel that lay at his feet, which he also went down into, was paved with glimmering jewels. The mountains he caused to appear were Himalaya and made Arjun's mountains seem like hillocks. And when he grew before the people, they could not see his face because it seemed to be hidden in the sun. His chariot not only flashed along the ground, but flew through the air, and he shot 9 arrows into the mouth of the revolving boar and 40 into the quiver he tossed up. When he had finished and stood radiant before them, the crowd was beside itself. Bhishma smiled to see the shock on Drona's face. There was no doubt that his pupil had been eclipsed by the golden warrior. Duryodhana ran forward and clasped the stranger in his arms. He cried, Welcome to Hastinapur, O greatest archer on earth. From today, I, Duryodhana, am yours to command, and the kingdom of the Kurus yours to enjoy. Let us be friends always. And there was genuine warmth in the Duryodhana not only sensed that here was the man who could tame Arjun for him, he also felt uncanny affection for the golden armored archer, as they shared an ancient pain from before this life. Flushed with the triumph, Karan said, We shall see today who the greater archer is, Arjun or I. I, Karan, challenge him to a duel. Arjun's face was crimson. How dare you come uninvited to our tournament? It is a tournament and all are welcome to show their skills at such exhibitions. Or did Arjun think it was arranged just for him? But I am challenging you, Pandav. Do you accept my challenge? Or would you rather admit that I am the better archer? Arjun roared. Come, braggart, I will send you to your fathers in hell. Coolly, Karan retorted. Why fight with words, which are women's weapons? Let us speak with arrows. Arjun pulled on his bowstring in fury. Abruptly, dark bluish clouds scudded into the sky. It was Indra, the god of rain, looking down on his son Arjun with a blessing. Then a single shaft of the sun pierced those clouds and lit the golden warrior. So this is the end of this chapter. Next chapter is chapter number 35, the golden warrior. Karan stood bathed, just he in the golden beam of the sun. Arjun stood darkling under his father's clouds, and suddenly Kunti realized who the stranger was. She remembered the day when she had floated her firstborn down the river of the past. So Karan was a son of Sun, and Arjun was the son of Indradev. And mother for both of them was Kunti. She remembered the kavach and the kundal he had worn. Blood rushed to her head, and Kunti fainted. Vidur called for some salts. He guessed it was the sight of the stranger that had upset her. Kneeling beside her, he held the sharp salts under her nose, and her eyes fluttered open. Vidur was startled when he saw the look on her face, tears in her voice. She began to blurt out something, but an instinct warned Vidur. Kunti must not say anything in this public place, least of all with Gandhari so near. Placing his hand across her lips, he shook his head. Rest now, this is not the time to speak. He helped her to sit up and gave her the salts to sniff again. Clasping her pain to her like a serpent's sting, Kunti steadied herself. She said to Gandhari, I don't know what came over me. Are you better now? I am well now. Once more, Kunti began to describe what went on below to the blindfolded queen. Patting her hand, Vidur returned to Dhritarashtra's side. In the arena, Krip, who was an expert in the etiquette of dueling, had stepped between the two warriors, hungry for a fight. Krip announced, Karan, a proper introduction is in order. Here before you, ready for battle, stands Kunti Devi's third son, Arjun, the Pandav of the royal house of Kuru. Now you tell us your own ancestry, young Kshatriya. Who is your father and to which family do you belong? You know that no prince will duel with an adversary of lesser lineage than himself. He smiled, no more than he will marry a princess from an inferior kingdom. The crowd laughed, but Karan was crestfallen. His handsome head was bent like a lotus in a storm, and his face was red with shame. As far as he knew, he was not Arjun's equal by birth, by a long way. A sigh rose from the crowd, and the jeers and catcalls came from the sections loyal to the Pandavas. Arjun stood haughtily before Karan, a sneer on his lips and another, altogether inexplicable, emotion in his heart. One he would feel every time he was face to face with this man, but he would never know until it was too late that it was the blood in his body responding to a brother. Then, like a king, cobra uncoiling, Duryodhan sprang up and cried in his deep, rough voice, My lord, the oldest dharma says that kings are of three kinds. Those who are born kings, those who become kings by their courage, and those who vanquish a king and so become kings themselves. I submit, my lord, that a king of the second sort is not necessarily a Kshatriya. Not only Kshatriyas are valiant, but other men as well, as they are blessed by God. A powerful passion was upon Duryodhan. His chest heaved. Valor is not the birthright of just Kshatriyas, but if Arjun means to make it a condition that Karan is a king before he fights him, then so be it. The crowd had grown silent. Whatever could Duryodhan mean? The dark prince said, the kingdom of the Ang, which is ours, has no king at the moment. We are happy to create our new friend Karan, the lord of Ang. Once he is crowned, let Arjun find no excuse for not fighting such a worthy adversary. You could hear your own heartbeat in that stadium. Karan's head jerked up and his eyes filled with incredulous hope. Duryodhan smiled at him, then he turned and crossed to the royal enclosure where he stood with his head bowed before Bhishma and Dhritarashtra, waiting for their approval. Bhishma was more proud of his prince than he ever been. He nodded his head, giving his blessing. Then he put his hands together and applauded Duryodhan's gesture, at which the entire crowd burst into loud cheering, calling out first Duryodhan's name and then Karan's. When Vidur told Dhritarashtra that Duryodhan stood before him for his approval, the blind king smiled. He raised both his arms and cried, You have our blessing for your noble deed, my son. Karan deserves to have a kingdom. Let him be lord of Ang. The people are eager to watch the contest between Arjun and him. A messenger ran Hot foot to the palace, a golden throne was fetched out to the stadium, and everything else that was needed for a coronation. Holy water, grains of rice, incense, flowers, chamras, silken whisks, and the white parasol that was the emblem of a king of the earth. The court priests were already present. Duryodhan took Karan by the arm and brought him to the dais on which the throne was set. The other Kauravas showered rice grains and flowers on him, as with just a glance of hesitation at his new friend, Karan ascended the throne amidst deafening cheers from the crowd. The priests began to chant the Vedic mantras for a coronation. Water from the ocean and the rivers of Bharatvarsh was poured over Karan's head. The white sovereign parasol was raised above him, and the crowd was on its feet. Finally, Duryodhan set a crown on Karan's head. He pulled his own sword from its sheath and gave it half first into Karan's hand. The Kaurav stepped back a pace and said, "Now, mighty Karan, you are king of Ang, and Arjun is just a prince. Let him not refuse to fight you anymore on pain of being known as a coward." The crowd was breathless. Karan rose in a daze. Choking, he said to Duryodhan, "I am not sure that I deserve this honor, my prince, and even if I do, how will I ever repay you for what you have done today?" For a moment, Duryodhan stared at Karan. Then he cracked a smile. "We have never seen an archer like you. Such a warrior deserves to have much more than insignificant Ang. Why, to me it seems you could rule the world." He paused, then gazing levelly at Karan said, "As for repayment, there is one thing I want in return for the small service I have done you. I want your friendship." Meeting his gaze, Karan laughed and said, "That is already yours." The two embraced each other before that crowd. Some of the people cried, "Duryodhan, yours is a noble heart. You are truly a Kuru prince." But others held their peace. They saw that the Pandavas were slighted by Duryodhan's gesture. Then everyone was startled to see an old man who walked with the help of a stick, pushing his way through the crowd. His wrinkled face was wreathed in a smile. He came straight into the arena, and when Karan saw him, he gave a cry of joy and ran to him. Patirath, the sooth charioteer, hugged his son and said, "What a fortune, my child." Karan knelt at the old man's feet and set the golden crown of Ang there. Patirath cried, "Prince Duryodhan, I bless you. You have a great heart." Now the Pandavas were full of scornful smiles. Bhim cried, "Sooth Putra, you aren't man enough to die at Arjun's hands. Go and ply your whip. It suits you better than a bow." The Pandavas and the sections of the crowd loyal to them laughed. A spinning weakness threatened to overwhelm Karn. He stood mute and lifted his eyes up to the sun. Surya, who was his guard. Kunti's eyes welled again when she saw her son praying to his own father like that, never knowing the Coruscant Dev was his sire. Once more, Duryodhan sprang up in his place. He was like a bull elephant in a must, about to trample a forest pool brimming with lotuses. He roared at Bhim, "Cousin, you are a Kshatriya, but you demean your birth. Why? What you say would demean a beggar. Valor isn't the preserve of just the Kshatriyas." He raged now, and the seething crowd was his true audience. Take the greatest rivers and warriors, and their sources are mysterious. It is the greatness they swell into during their course through the world that counts. Moreover, the births of the greatest men have always been obscure. Why, the most awesome fire, Bhajav, is to be found below the ocean, where it slumbers until the apocalypse, when it erupts to consume heaven and earth. Think of the origins of our own gurus, Drona and Kripa. One was born in a river shell, the other in a bank of reeds. Think, for that matter, of the birth of our own fathers and of our uncle Vidur. Think of your own births or Pandavas, who were never Pandu's sons. The world knows your mother took their three lovers, whoever they were, and you three were born. Who are you to talk of origins and lineage, that you pour scorn on this hero? Who from his qualities, why from his very face, is more of a Kshatriya than you or I? I say Karan deserves to be lord of the earth, and if you were not blind, Bhim, you would see that too. On every feature of his noble stranger, I see greatness stamped. I don't care whose son he is. To me, he is a Kshatriya, and among Kshatriyas, he shall live. Now tell your high-born brother to fight the king of Ang, of course, if he dares to. But then abruptly night fell. It was too dark now for a duel. But Karan had stolen Arjun's thunder today. Moreover, Duryodhan's gesture towards the brilliant stranger had endeared him to the crowd, which now filed its way out of stadium praising the Kaurav prince. No one spoke of Arjun's feats tonight. Duryodhan knew the appearance of Karan was the best omen in his life. He felt certain that from now on his fortunes would change for the better. By torchlight, through the festive streets where singing and dancing broke out, it was the heroes of the evening who led the procession. Karan, king of Ang, and his friend Duryodhan, the Kaurav prince. They walked with arms linked, glowing with their friendship, so well struck. Bhishma seemed pleased, perhaps because Drona's arrogance had been shorn a little today. The patriarch walked behind Duryodhan and Karan with a gleam in his eye. He greeted the people as if every one of them was his own child. But Drona walked at the very end of the procession and hid his face from the glare of the torches. Vidur too was pensive beside Drona. And behind Vidur walked the humbled Pandavas, solemn, even sullen. Yudhishthir managed to greet some of the crowd, yet even he was shaken today. He had always felt that his position and his brothers were unassailable because of Bhim's strength and Arjun's fearless archery. But Duryodhan was at least Bhim's equal, and today the Kaurav had made a friend who was clearly Arjun's equal. Karan had appeared like a dangerous comet in Yudhishthir's sky, and the eldest Pandav was far seeing enough to realize this. Behind Yudhishthir walked Arjun stiffly, sweat on his face, and his hands clammy. His spirits were lower than they had ever been since the day he saw Eklavya. But Karan was not Drona's pupil, and the Acharya could not ask him for his thumb. Beside Arjun walked the young giant Bhim, and he was also too angry to greet the people who were anyway busy lionizing Karan and Duryodhan. His hands were clenched and his mouth set in a tight line. He was smarting under Duryodhan's assault on him. Of course, what really hurt him was the very word his cousin had said was true. Bhim had never felt so small in all his life or so petty. His heart burning with shame, his face red in the torchlight, he walked behind Yudhishthir with a somber Nakul and Sahadev behind him. So grim did the usually ebullient Bhim look tonight that none of the people dared approach him. Next chapter, Drona's revenge. Okay, so if you remember, Drona and Drupada, they were friends. They learned together in the ashram of Drona's father. And Drupad was a king. So now Drona wants to take a revenge. Let's read this. Drona saw how Arjun had become subdued and withdrawn after the exhibition. The prince's education was complete. Their guru called them all, Pandavas and Kauravas, and said, "Your shiksha is complete. Now give me my dakshina." They saw the deep fire in his eyes. Bhim said, "We can never pay you back for everything you have taught us. But say what you want, Acharya. We will move the earth for you." "All the wealth of the Kurus is at your disposal," said one of the Kaurav princes. Drona turned on him and snapped, "It isn't the wealth I want. All my needs are already seen to." A wistful look came into his eyes. "It is revenge I want, much sweeter than all the wealth in the world." Yudhishthir said evenly, "What revenge, Guru? We will give our lives to get you whatever you want." A spasm of darkness twitched on Drona's face. "I want you to bring Drupad to me as a prisoner. Go to the Panchal kingdom, defeat him in battle, Bring him to me alive. But remember, it was said no archer on earth could match Drupad. He paused and looked at Arjun, then added softly, somehow I don't think that is true anymore. Well, will you give me my Dakshina? The Kuru princes, Kauravas, and Pandavas cried together, we will. Bhishma, Vidur, and Dhritarashtra supported Drona's cause. An army was mustered, with the young Kurus at its head, and Drona himself going with them. That force set out for the Panchal kingdom. Exhilarated at the prospect of a real battle, they rode to Drupad's capital. Their Acharya was the most excited of them all, like his pupils had never seen him before. When he saw the army from Hastinapur surround his city, Kampilya, Drupad was puzzled. He had no quarrel with the Kurus, but he was a Kshatriya too, and a great one. In no time, his legions were ready to repulse the invaders. Outside the city walls, Kuru horsemen took their positions for the attack, but the Kaurav princes were almost coming to blows. Each one was so eager to lead the first charge. Drona was having trouble keeping them calm, and now the Pandavas won their first battle. Not that their blood wasn't up as well, but the sons of Pandu behaved with composure. The five of them stood aside quietly under a tree. Duryodhan wanted to lead the first onslaught. Yudhishthir, the eldest prince, said he had no objection. When the Kaurav force charged the Panchal army, the Pandavas stayed back with their guru. Arjun's dejection of the past weeks fell away from him. He was confident Drupad will prove too much for our cousins. They have no archer who can face him. Drona murmured, let us wait and see. But he knew Arjun was right. The Brahman knew what a warrior Drupad was. He also knew his own fortunes had changed. He could feel it in his body. Let Drupad tire himself against the Kauravas, then Arjun could go into battle. Weapons flashing, chariots thundering, their roars deafening, the Kaurav legion charged the defending Panchal force. The front line of the defense fell to Duryodhan, their heads crushed by his mace blows. His brothers were terrible around him, and it seemed the Panchals would be quickly overcome. The Kauravas breached the front gates of Kampilya. On horseback and in chariots, they stormed up the streets, felling Drupad's soldiers at will. They gained the central square of the Panchal capital. The sides of his chariot bloody, a triumphant Duryodhan was about to hoist the Kuru flag there. Suddenly, deep sea conches boomed and the palace gates flew open. From them rode Drupad in a white chariot like a wheel of fire. Cutting down everything in his way, he came, and his arrows were a wave of wizardry. His chariot, too, was not less than magical. It seemed to be everywhere at once. Now the blood-soaked square rang with the screams of Kuru soldiers, mown down like stalks of wheat. His horses were so swift, it seemed there was not one Drupad, but 100, 1,000 of him. By himself, the Panchal king was like an army of Yam. Not an arrow left his bow, but it claimed an enemy life, and his shafts flowed in a torrent. The flag fell from Duryodhan's fingers. He saw there was no Kaurav who could remotely match the Panchal king. Duryodhan called out to his brothers to retreat. They turned their chariots and fled before Drupad raised the army between himself and them and came for their lives. Only Dushashan, Duryodhan's fiercest brother, stood his ground briefly. Dushashan wounded Drupad from his side with a sizzling salvo like hot light. The Panchal king broke the bow in the prince's hand and shot the helm off his head. The Kaurav fell on his chariot floor and screamed at his Sarathi, fly for our lives. Armed with staves, knives, household pestles, and whatever else they could lay their hands on, the common people of Kampilya came roaring out of their homes. They fell on the last stragglers of the Kaurav army. Even as they clubbed and hacked them to death, victory conches blasted and drum rolls resounded in Drupad's jubilant city. Drupad himself fell ill at ease. He chose not to pursue the fleeting Kauravas and finish them off outside his walls. Instead, he remained within his gates as if he were a coward. Meanwhile, Duryodhan and his brothers came howling before Drona. He did not warn us about Drupad. There's no archer like him on earth. We couldn't stand against him. No one can. Seeing how they trembled, doubt clutched at Drona. He thought he might have overestimated the Kuru princes. Perhaps the time had come for him to take the field himself against Drupad. Then 5 young Kshatriyas stepped out from under the tree where they had been waiting patiently. They touched their Guru's feet and said, "We will attack Drupad now." Arjun and Bhim glowed with anticipation, but none of the frenzy the Kauravas had shown. Laying his palm on their heads, Drona blessed them. Arjun said, "There's no need for Yudhishthir to come with us. We 4 will bring Drupad back to you." Duryodhan and his brothers laughed. Dushashan cried, "4 of you, where 100 of us failed, bid farewell to your brother and your Guru before you go." Duryodhan nudged his brother to make him stop, lest Drona held the Pandavs back. The Kaurav was sure Drupad would kill the 4 foolhardy Pandavs. Then Yudhishthir would be at Duryodhan's mercy. He may not even need to have him killed. Drona said, "Yudhishthir, you will be king one day. You must not ride into this battle. You others beware of Drupad." Bhim, Arjun, Nakul, and Sahadev climbed into their chariots. Drona asked, "Won't you take the army with you?" Arjun replied, "We will go by ourselves." Bhim blew a blast on his conch, rattling the masonry on Drupad's ramparts. Roaring then a pride of young lions on their first hunt, their manes flying in the wind, their bodies shining. Devputras, that they were, the 4 Pandavas, flew at the gates of Campania. Bhim rode in front. The very sight of him, a titan with a huge mace gleaming in his hands, made Drupad's soldiers break ranks and run. But he was on them like an angry force of nature, smashing down elephants and horses, mowing down foot soldiers, blood flying, screams ringing. The Panchal ranks parted like a school of Minaus for a wail, their courage broken. They fled even as the Vanars once did in Lanka when Kumbhakarna came to battle. In moments, a way was clear between Arjun and Drupad. Drupad raised his bow and arrows, flared like thoughts from it, the same livid stream that had put the Kauravas to flight. But it was an archer of a different caliber, who now faced him in that wide city square. Arjun, the son of Indra, confronted the Panchal king. From Arjun's bow, a tide of arrows rose and drowned Drupad's stream in the air. The Pandav prince matched the Panchal king shaft for shaft and beat him back. Drupad's Kshatriyas, all fine archers, surrounded Arjun's chariot and covered him in fire. But then it seemed unearthly power was upon the Pandav prince. They did not see his shafts anymore, but a river of light seemed to flow from his bow. Most eerily, they no longer saw Arjun himself. He was just a ghostly blur. His archery seemed to have absorbed him bodily. Yet screams of death rent the air. The river of light was made of deadly arrows, and everyone took a life. Drupad's Kshatriyas had always thought their king was a matchless bowman, but this prince's archery was godlike, and the fear he brought unbearable. They either fled from him or perished. Roaring to keep his own courage, and in fact awestruck by Arjun's genius, Drupad charged the Pandav. As Sambar the Daitya once charged Indra, Drupad plunged at Arjun, hoping to shatter the young man's nerve. A thunderclap exploded in the space between the 2 rats, then 6 more. Smoke billowed around Drupad's chariot. When that king looked up from the moment's destruction, he saw his Sarthi and horses were dead, and his flagstaff cut down. Now he felt the bow in his hands, the jeweled weapon given him by his master Bhardwaj, riven by a silver shaft. Arjun stood facing Drupad, and the king trembled with shock. No other archer on earth could have done this to him. Arjun's bowstring was drawn to his ear, and his next arrow aimed at Drupad's heart. With the moon, the Panchal prepared to die. Then Arjun dropped his bow and leapt down from his chariot. In a flash, he was at Drupad's side. He soared across the king's throat like 3 legions. Bhim, Nakul, and Sahadev held the Panchal army at bay. Arjun hauled Drupad into his own chariot. The shame Karan had wrapped him in falling away like a dream. The Pandav rode back to his guru with his prisoner. Now Bhim had leapt down from his chariot. Gripped by bloodlust, he was slaughtering Drupad's soldiers like helpless children. Arjun swerved his chariot towards his brother and cried, Drupad is related to the Kurus. Bhim, leave his army. Let us take our Dakshina to the Acharya. Reluct- Reluctantly, Bhim lowered his bloody mace, and dissatisfied though he left 100 corpses behind him, rode out of the city. Roaring, the brothers issued from the smashed gates of Campilya. When the Kuru soldiers saw Arjun bring Drupad out with a sword at his throat, they rushed forward again to have revenge for their earlier rout. Drona saw Arjun ride towards him with his captive. Arjun pulled Drupad down from his chariot and marched him to Drona. Drupad breathed, You, I should have guessed. Yes, these are my Shishyas. Tears stung Drupad's eyes. That proud Kshatriya stood with his head bowed before Drona. Drona had forgotten nothing of his own humiliation by the Panchal. He savored the moment silently. Then he said, You once said that friendship was possible only between equals. It seemed to me that today you have need of my friendship. Today, my old friend, we are not equals. When you spat on our friendship, Drupad, I stood helpless before you with nothing I could call my own. Time has come a full circle. Now it is you who have nothing, Drupad. Your kingdom is not yours anymore. My pupils have crushed your army. Arjun's sword is at your throat, and not even your life is yours. One word from me, and he will kill you. But we Brahmins, even the poorest among us, are forgiving. You and I spent some happy years in my father's ashram. I have never forgotten these years. Drupad, here I offer you my hand once more in friendship. Remember, this hand holds your life in it. Take it, Panchal, be my friend. His heart dying within him for shame, but never showing a trace of it, Drupad took Drona's hand. The Brahman was so happy he forgot his anger and embraced Drupad. Drona cried, You said that friendship can be only between equals. Well, I will make an equal of you, you poor pauper. To prove that I still want to be your friend, I return half of your kingdom to you. No Kshatriya would have committed that foolishness, but would have killed Drupad for fear of his revenge. Drona was a Brahman. He thought naively that everything was forgotten. He cried, Look, there is the Ganga. I return all the lands south of it to you, to be your kingdom. All the Panchal lands north of the river, I will keep for myself. He laughed, so that we can always be equals and thus be friends. Drupad returned Drona's embrace. Drona, let us be friends forever. Drona had tears in his eyes. Drupad thought, the young Arjun is a peerless Kshatriya. I must have a daughter whom he will marry. And of course, I must perform a yajna and pray for a son as well, who will kill Drona for what he has done today. Drupad ruled his remaining kingdom from Kampilya in the province of Makandi, from the Ganga up to the banks of the river Charmanvati. Drona ruled the northern Panchal lands with all its towns and people, the country called Ahichatra. It was the Pandavas and especially Arjun's Guru Dakshina to him. Next chapter is long, but let's just at least read a couple of pages of this. A father and his son. Dhritarashtra was king of Hastinapur and the Kurus. But the people knew it was Pandu's campaigns that had extended the boundaries of the Kuru kingdom as far as they were now. Besides, Yudhishthir was older than Duryodhan. The Pandav was noble, steadfast, and utterly honest. Against his own wishes, Dhritarashtra crowned his brother's son Yuvraj of the Kuru kingdom, the heir apparent. Yudhishthir quickly proved himself wise and discerning far beyond his years. One day, shortly after the humbling of Drupad, Drona called all the Pandavas and Kauravas. The Acharya seemed distressed. The previous night he had a prophetic dream in which a horrible war of the age was revealed to him and his own role in it. Dismayed by what he had seen, Drona assembled all his pupils in his yard. It was to Arjun that he said, I received the Brahmasirsa from my Guru Agnivesh, and my master had the Astra from Agastya Muni. He paused to show how serious he was. Only to you, Arjun, have I given the secret of that weapon. For if you summon it, it can destroy the world. I know your heart is strong. I know you will never lightly invoke the Ayudha that bears the heads of Brahma. Yet I have given you a great gift in the Brahmsirs, and I now demand a special dakshina from you. Arjun said quietly, my life is yours if you want it. That I know, but what I want from you is that you swear on oath to me something that may be harder to pledge than your life. Tell me what it is, Acharya. If you know what I want, you may not give it even to me. First, to swear that whatever I ask you will give me unconditionally. Arjun drew a deep breath. I swear it in your name, and by all that is sacred to me. I want you to swear that if someday I face you in battle, you will fight me without reserve, even to the death of one of us. Arjun cried out softly. The other princes gasped, but Drona stood waiting. At last, Arjun nodded wordlessly. Now Drona smiled and said to the others, you are all witnesses to his vow. We must honor it at any cost. For a year more, Drona kept just Arjun near him. As his most remarkable disciple, he taught him secrets and refinements to his archery beyond the grasp of any other pupil, including Ashwatthama. Avidly, Arjun learnt those subtle and complex lessons from his guru. Finally, one day, Drona called his favorite Shishya. The master appeared exceptionally relaxed and he made Arjun sit beside him. They were alone together. Drona said, your tutelage is complete. This last year has been invaluable. Now I think I can proclaim that my Shishya Arjun is the greatest archer on earth. Arjun glowed. The Pandav had grown with each day that passed, not only in skill, but in spirit. At last he felt he had put Karan, the only thread, behind him. Drona said quietly, yet if I were to tell the world that you are the greatest archer in it, Arjun, I would be lying. Arjun gave a start. So Karan was still better than he was. His face grew dark. Drona laughed. I'm not speaking of Karan, but of another. His voice was wistful. Another like whom there has never been any archer in all times and never shall be. Who is he, Acharya? Your own cousin, Arjun, Krishna of the house of Vrishni. Your mother has a brother called Vasudev. Krishna is his son. He smiled and shook his head, though in truth he is no one's child but his own. For he has no beginning or end. He is all things and all men. He is the avatar, and he knows about you and longs to see you. Arjun felt a surge of elation as if Krishna's was the name he had been waiting all his life to hear. An ecstatic current coursed in his heart, as if everything meaningful in his life was enshrined in that name. It was an unprecedented emotion that swept over the young Pandav, one he could not explain at all. As for jealousy, Arjun felt no trace of it, as he had with Ekalavya and Karan. He only felt an uncanny joy. From far away, recalling Arjun from the reverie he had lapsed into, Drona was saying, humility is a great thing, Arjun, much greater than archery. So we'll stop our reading here today. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnam Udachyate Purnasya Purnam Adaye Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti 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 Om. Thank you very much.